Chapter 1. The already hot mid-morning sun gleamed through the windows of the streetcar, and the rattle of the metal made its usual racket. Two girls sat together in the back of the streetcar and leaned their heads in towards each other in a conspiratorial way to make themselves heard. One of the girls had a basket on her knees, with a large floral bouquet sticking out of it. The other one was animatedly motioning with her hands as she spoke. The streetcar reached a stop. The doors creaked open. A blast of moist, late-spring air, scented with bougainvillea and New Orleans city traffic smells, hit them, and a younger man stepped in, removing his hat with his empty hand, while the other pulled a briefcase in behind him. The animated young girl stopped waving her arms, smoothed down her hair, put her hands in her lap, and sat up straighter. Her companion shook her head and whispered loudly, "Why go to all that trouble when he is sitting in front of us and cannot even see you? And what's more, he has a mustache like Grover Cleveland. Stop holding your breath in. You look ridiculous." The other girl let her shoulders slouch forward again and gave a good-natured, half-suppressed laugh. "Well, he may look like Grover Cleveland, but he got on at the stop across from the bank, so he could be a banker." She gazed out the window and then sighed. "A banker can look like a complete roach as long as he takes me far away from a future in laundry." "Do be a little bit practical, Nadine," said the girl with the basket, keeping her voice low lest they be overheard. "If he's getting on the streetcar and driving away from the bank building before lunchtime, it's far more likely he went in to get a loan and was turned away, or maybe he was fired. So, a former banker with an ugly mustache? No, thank you." Her friend smiled. "We have some imagination, though. Well, I'll sit up straight anyways. Mother always says that a true lady sits up very straight on every occasion. But tell me more about this dinner that your mother is hosting this evening. Irene told me she saw her at the hairdresser's getting a fresh set on her hair. Who is your mystery guest?" "It's not much of a mystery. It's going to be a paunchy, middle-aged fabric salesman who is dull as dust. Mother is still hopeful she will catch another husband, and this sad specimen is her latest possibility. She had me go into town for this bouquet for the table. She had updated her favorite gown over the last few weeks, and she is making poulet valet d'auge for dinner. I suppose I should be grateful that she hasn't made me borrow Mrs. Murphy's harp and learn to play it to provide them with after-dinner music." The girl looked down at the bouquet and sighed. "You don't think we will ever become like that, do you? I think it would be perfectly ridiculous, spending a week repinning and resewing a perfectly good dress, only to stand around in the kitchen then in this heat and cook poulet valet d'auge for a salesman." "Never," said her friend with conviction. "We shall be queens." The girl gazed out the window. They were passing every familiar landmark that she had passed 1,000,000 times before. She thought about riding this same streetcar line forever, being 100 and still running into town for thread and buttons for someone else, growing ancient while waiting for some middle-aged salesman to propose marriage. She knew that her friend Nadine harbored a vision of a handsome young suitor with enough means to provide her with a fantastic new life, but for herself, she always thought that was much too childish. What handsome, eligible banker would look twice at a laundry girl and a second-rate seamstress, except perhaps in the pursuit of some shameful, brief amusement? She wanted to believe what Nadine believed, but whenever she attempted to dream up a perfect suitor, she always stumbled to make the vision believable to herself. Her mother called her practical little manager. She had found them the smaller, less expensive apartment that they now rented in Milnberg, and the economization had allowed them to begin to save a bit of funds every month now. They had half-heartedly discussed a voyage by rail to visit her mother's sister who lived out of town, but the truth was that her mother was hoping it would help to finance a wedding gown should a second proposal come to fruition. A husband who brought additional funds into the family would be useful, but to have to put up with a paunchy fabric salesman and his potential paunchy offspring to get this security seemed like an unfair joke of life. Perhaps it was best to never marry. The world was full of young girls, eager to marry anyone at all, lest they end up old maids. But the girl was not afraid of spinsterhood. She would improve her sewing, have enough work to keep herself a small household of her own. Perhaps there could even be a sunny courtyard with climbing plants, like she had seen while peeking through a high gate in the French Quarter. And here she was, dreaming the same kind of unlikely silliness that Nadine or her mother dreamed. Perhaps it was best not to dream. By the time the streetcar came to their stop, the young man with the mustache had long since gotten off, and lunchtime was approaching. The girls parted ways, and the girl with the basket ran down the street to the apartment where her mother was waiting. The inside of the small apartment was already sweltering. "Vivian," she sang out in the melodic voice that she always reserved for the times when she was most happy. "I do hope you haven't crushed that bouquet too badly. Here, pass it to me. I left the vase ready in the icebox so that it should hopefully perk these blossoms up. I hope you can finish the beadwork on the end of Mrs. Austen's shawl after lunch. She needs it for the theater on Friday evening." Vivian handed her mother the basket and frowned. Who would wear a shawl to anywhere near New Orleans in June? "Oh, my dear, you understand nothing about fashion or the whims of our clients. Mrs. Austen needs this shawl because her sister-in-law has one like this, only without any beads, and her sister-in-law is visiting in town this week and will be in attendance at the theater. Mrs. Austen has been waiting these 6 months to stick a finger in her sister-in-law's eye, so the weather temperature is entirely irrelevant. And you be grateful that Mrs. Austen is as impractical as she is, else she would never consent to pay additional for a rush order to fancy up a scrap of sheer fabric with beads and call it a continental-style scarf. And we need that money because this dinner's going to be a feast. We have the flowers, the wine, the chicken, the creme fraiche, the calvados. And soon we will have one fabric salesman also, as if we had ordered him from a catalogue," interrupted Vivian. Her mother frowned, but only briefly. "I know what you are trying to do. You're trying to make me lose my temper. Vivian, there are things you do not yet understand about the world. A woman without a husband is in a difficult spot, and it has not been easy raising you on my own. You take too much for granted, such as how well things have turned out for us. But to imagine that our luck will always hold, that we will forever be able to keep out of the poorhouse, well, you must realize that we seamstresses are always hanging by the proverbial thread. Mr. Bosco could be our way to a whole new life." She finished fluffing the bouquet in the vase, turned to her daughter, and took her daughter's hands in hers. "It is also for you, Vivian. I want better for you. Soon you will be in your marriageable years, and who could you possibly meet here?" "A mustachioed, rejected loan applicant on the streetcar," said Vivian bitterly. Did you meet one?" her mother asked absent-mindedly. "Surely you can see that a life with Mr. Bosco in Meridian would offer you so much more. You would move in better circles. He has a home in a better community, and I do not doubt that the congregation on Sundays is overflowing with successful salesmen and tradesmen just like himself. Maybe you could have a small coming-out party. I would make your dress." Vivian sighed. Usually the descriptions of this fantasy dress took up the better part of half an hour, but today her mother was preoccupied with the upcoming dinner. Probably Vivian was the only girl in Louisiana who didn't dream of a fine gown and a party in her honor. If anyone had asked her in that moment whether there was anything she did dream of, she would have said merely, not to have the life she had. No dress, no matter how perfect, could wipe away the many shortcomings of her life, such as it was. And somehow, she couldn't make herself believe that Mr. Bosco could take all these shortcomings away and replace them with a wonderful new life for someone who was not his own daughter. She left her mother in the kitchen to continue with her preparations and took up the shawl with its beads. The chair by the window, where the sewing machine was, afforded the sunniest spot, although it was also the hottest space in the room. But a seamstress must guard her eyes and fingers if she was to maintain her trade, and the sunlight was the best light for fine needlework. Her mother was a natural seamstress, a real artisan whose talent was being wasted on expanding the waistlines of her aging clients or sewing the fashions of yesteryear for the ones who felt too timid for current fashions. Her mother, who could take a burlap bag and turn it into a suit, was stitching her days away on mostly unworthy jobs, but at least she was without doubt in the correct profession. Vivian herself sewed with bitterness. The needle never seemed to do her bidding on the first try, and although her work improved to passable quality as she grew older, she had learned to leave all of the more elaborate work to her mother, because it wasn't worth doing it only to have her mother redo it. As a true craftswoman, her mother was also inordinately proud of her work and refused to have anything less than perfection leave her apartment. The expectation that Vivian begin to bloom into a wonderful seamstress was a sore point between them. The law in the state of Louisiana was that a child could withdraw from school at age 14 to work in a home industry. So it was simply a fact of life that was always Vivian's destiny. But even though it was not unexpected when it happened, still, it had been a first kind of bitterness about her life. She was not particularly interested in school. She could not imagine much reading for pleasure, and she did not have all that much curiosity about the scholarly world. But she did miss her friends and the relative freedom that school had afforded her. Nadine had left school at the same time, so in their loneliness they spent more time with each other. But in days filled with separate work for them both, it was difficult to find much time for fun excursions. While they both agreed that life without school was far harder, Nadine had taken it quite well and had maintained her good-natured demeanor. Vivian had not been able to fight down a rebellious instinct in herself, and it was the same bitterness that now caused her to stab through the thin fabric of the shawl with more force than was required. She had to keep dipping her hands in the nearby basin and mopping her brow with a damp cloth to keep from sweating on the garment she was working on. All of this effort, and all so that Mrs. Austin could keep up in the pointless competition with her out-of-town sister-in-law. Vivian prayed sincerely that Mrs. Austin would be the only woman in a shawl within miles of the theater, and that she would feel appropriately foolish. The thought of having to hurry with a beating so that she could then help her mother prepare the dinner for Mr. Bosco only further fueled her aggravation. Her mother had been successful in gathering a handful of valuable clients, of whom Mrs. Austin was merely one. there was Mrs. Duval, Mrs. Pringley, Mrs. Pringley's sister, Mrs. Beaufort, who was a terrible tyrant, even Vivian's mother agreed, a few others, and an entire group of ladies associated with the Conservatoire Clarisse School of Dance, for whom they also sewed the costumes for recitals. It was a small but loyal client base, enough to keep them both busy. Not nearly as many new dresses these days as things being let out or otherwise adjusted, but all the seamstresses complained of the same, and times were so hard. The sun, which had stood high above the apartment when Vivian had arrived home, began its slide down the humid white sky. Vivian took a break with her mother, and they ate a very small lunch. The expense had gone into the dinner, after all, and it would also do no good to look like a pair of bloated matrons when their guest arrived, so they made do with just a few bites. Hunger never plagued Vivian, but certainly there had been times when meals had been spare, and more expensive meats were a rare treat. Her mother never liked to talk about money troubles, and so she would claim that she was merely following a new diet in an attempt to slim up for a dress she was planning to redo for herself. But Vivian was still quite young when she had figured out the truth. Her mother often gave up the most nutritious portions of her own food for Vivian. And then there were the weeks when the meals were more baguettes and rice than anything else. Vivian had grown into a young woman of 16 now, of average to slightly shorter height, but with a decidedly slim aspect. It was all right. All the new pictures from Hollywood showed starlets in drapey white fabric hanging off of their slender frames. Vivian didn't have much opportunity to see new pictures, but she did pass the posters in front of the theater on her trips around town. However, unlike her, all of the starlets had stylish, mid-length hairstyles, whereas her mother had not allowed her to cut her long hair, claiming that shorter hairstyles were a luxury that only married women ought to indulge in. How unfortunate it would be to meet an eligible young bachelor only to lose his interest for a lack of long hair. Vivian knew better than to retort that any man for whom length of hair was a key attribute for a wife must be a fool. The depression had hit everyone hard, but for women living and working on their own, life had become particularly hard, and the search for a husband had become both more critical and more difficult. Vivian was raised from an early age to begin to prepare herself for a fierce competition for a husband, and her mother always said that although he should be a handsome and perfect prince, he needed to have a kingdom and a paying vocation above all, since the key duty of a man was to provide stability. It was only as she grew older that Vivian realized that this advice came from her mother's own past errors, since the way that her mother had met and married her father was anything but a marriage established on stability and practicality. They had met when he had bought an old draft horse off of her father, and he was every bit as dashing and desperate as a used horse salesman could be expected to be. Maybe that was what made it tolerable to now consider marriage to an aging fabric salesman. The memory that at one point her mother had followed her heart and apparently had the kind of love affair that young girls were always being warned against, but that they nevertheless dreamed about. What did it matter who you married after you had already loved and left someone so dashing? When she really thought about it, Vivian's greatest fear was that she wouldn't have any such moment in her life, that she would go straight from this small, overheated apartment, smelling of the neighbors' cooking fumes, and into a marriage with someone like Mr. Bosco, with nary a dashing horse salesman in sight. She tried to talk about this with Nadine, but Nadine was so full of dreams that she couldn't even understand the fear. Nadine kept bringing up unlikely stories from ladies' magazines that she had read at her clients' homes while waiting for the family servants to bring down the laundry. In these stories, continental dukes in disguise popped up in every corner butcher shop, or made a liaison with a working girl and then demanded that he be permitted to marry her, or he would run away with her and leave it all behind. In some stories, the heroine became the Duchess, and in others, they would run away and live in a rustic paradise and keep their own bees for honey. Vivian would roll her eyes at both outcomes. Then she would laugh with Nadine. But at night, in the dark, she would look up at the ceiling and try to daydream. All she could imagine vividly was a future full of nothing but dullness and duty and struggle. There was more than a streak of Nadine in her own mother, Vivian thought. Even now, her mother was busy preparing everything for the dinner, humming to herself as she moved from the kitchen to the room where the dining table was, and where Vivian slept at night on a small mattress on the floor. The recipe called for calvados, and they had scrimped and saved for this bottle. Now Vivian could hear her mother open the bottle and tinker with the glass. The moment of celebration at last was close at hand. The sunlight slanted in through the windows now and pooled on the floor like a form of visible happiness. The world's most ordinary fabric salesman might be walking through that door in another hour or so, but he was going to be the recipient of the most exciting repast that had yet been seen in that small apartment since they moved into it. On his previous visits, her mother and Mr. Bosco had always gone out alone, but now, eager to seal some kind of agreement on a more permanent relationship with him, it had to be a home-cooked meal which would showcase what kind of a cook and hostess he would be gaining if he proposed marriage. Vivian had scrubbed the window 4 times over before her mother had been pleased with it, the floor at least 3, and their modest possessions had been moved about and readjusted countless times now for a more pleasing effect. A good housekeeper shows she keeps a tidy and well-run home even in a small room, her mother had said to Vivian. The late Mrs. Bosco had apparently been a bit spendthrift. Well, perhaps it was the only cure for the terrible dullness that had to be the inevitable burden of having married Mr. Bosco. Vivian, are you still in here sewing? Why, Mr. Bosco will be here before you know it, and you need to get into your dress. Forget the dinner. I can manage that. Just run, Vivian, run. Vivian dutifully put the almost finished scarf away and went through the fabric curtain that served as the door to the small alcove that served as her mother's bedroom. Here, put this on. I touched up the neckline a bit for you with some fresh lace, explained her mother, standing behind her. I do hope you like it. Vivian put on the adjusted dress, looked in the mirror, and smiled in spite of herself. You mean not all of your efforts have only been for Mr. Bosco? She turned to her mother and embraced her, a rather rare occurrence between them. Oh, my child, I cannot begin to imagine what my life would have been like without you. The devil take Mr. Bosco and 1,000 others like him before that any harm should come to you. We are always together, aren't we? And so it will remain, no matter what happens. Oh dear, I hope that's not the chicken burning. Her mother let go of Vivian and daintily hurried back to the small stove. Vivian poured some more of the not-very-cool water from the pitcher into the basin that stood in the corner of the alcove and splashed off her face and neck. Then she quickly finished getting ready. Her mother finished preparing the dinner and then also came to get dressed. Vivian assisted her, and then they both went out to the large mirror to look at the finished masterpiece. There they both stood, so alike, their glossy, pale brown hair almost identical in color, matching slim, petite physiques, and a kind of elegance in their bearing. Vivian looked at her mother and sighed with awe. Never had her mother looked lovelier. The dress was the same dress that Vivian had seen on her mother for years, and yet it was suddenly different, more stylish, tighter across the torso and hips, and with a new fabric belt and an additional layer of fabric at the bottom of the dress to create a kind of flounce. No one who saw this dress for the first time would imagine anything other than that it came out of the fashion pages of the current year's styles. Marie Prevet was a seamstress who could create magic with her needle. Of that there was no doubt. Swelling with pride, Vivian suddenly felt certain that no salesman from Meridian was even good enough for someone with as much skill and style as her mother. She deserved nothing less than a king. And standing there beside her, Vivian suddenly felt like a lady-in-waiting to a heroine in a book. It was like she was a pale star next to this brilliant radiance that was her mother. "You look incredibly beautiful," she said to her. Her mother smiled back. "Let's get the last preparations completed then. He should be here quite soon now." They moved about the small apartment and set the table, set out the flowers, and prepared the candles. Perfect in that they served both as an elegance and a kind of economy. At the stroke of the hour, they were ready. It was to be an early dinner, but as their lunch had been so small, they were both already hungry. The small table-side clock ticked loudly as the colors of evening filled the room. Vivian opened the windows and aired out the apartment as best she could, given that the air was hanging like a dull weight and refusing to exert itself into even the slightest breeze. A breeze might come later, but then so would the mosquitoes, and as a girl Vivian had already been struck by what the doctors had diagnosed in her as yellow fever. Time passed in this way, with small and needless activities, until it was apparent that Mr. Bosco would be arriving late. Her mother began to pace and to wring her hands. The food would have to be reheated, even more than had been the original plan. Oh, they shouldn't have put the flowers on the table so early. Why, look, they were already starting to look wilted. And they waited and waited. The more that the time passed, the more Vivian's disliking for this Mr. Bosco increased. Who did he think he was? Was this how gentlemen called on ladies up in Meridian? Maybe his overall boorishness was what had pushed the first Mrs. Bosco into an early grave. Vivian angrily sat down at the window, looked out into the small and narrow street, and began to hope that their visitor would never arrive. She hadn't been able to enjoy this hope for very long, however, before a man in a brown suit and brown hat appeared down in the street below her. "Is that him?" she asked her mother and pointed. Her mother hurried over and peered over Vivian's shoulder. "Oh, yes, it is. Don't stand there at the window pointing at him. What if he sees you?" Vivian didn't think that a man arriving to dinner well over an hour late had much ground to stand on in accusing others of inelegance, but she said nothing, only stood up and smoothed out her dress and got prepared at the door. Her mother flew to the doorknob at the first knock, and there, in the front doorway, stood the one and only Mr. Bosco, fabric salesman from Meridian, Mississippi, in a lumpy, textured brown suit and brown hat, holding a small suitcase and looking like an unimaginative caricature of a middle-aged, portly salesman. He was rather more rotund than Vivian had imagined he might be, and his eyes lit up as he entered the room, probably at the delicious scents of food. "Mr. Bosco, welcome to our humble place," began her mother, extending her hand to him. He took it, and it vanished almost entirely in his fleshy paw. "Oh, Mrs. Prevett, even more charming than I remembered. Ah, and who is this?" He swiveled his head around, the tufts of hair above his ears giving him the appearance of a man older than Vivian thought he might be. "Mr. Bosco, allow me to introduce my daughter Vivian. We live here together. She is a seamstress apprentice to me, you might say." The salesman extended his large hand towards her and took her cool fingers into his moist ones. His eyes sparkled. "What a pleasure to make your acquaintance, Miss Vivian. I see you share your mother's elegance and beauty." Vivian curtsied modestly. "Do step inside, Mr. Bosco. Dinner will be ready in but a moment. Vivian, please offer our guest a drink. Did you have a good journey?" Mr. Bosco sat down on the small chair at the dining table, and it squeaked helplessly as he dropped his bulk onto it. Vivian had taken his hat, and now he was mopping his brow with a handkerchief that he had pulled out from his pocket. "Travel is almost never very pleasant this time of year, but a successful salesman must endure all kinds of hardships. Whenever anything vexes me, I always say that it is nothing that would stop Mr. Purdue's top-ranking salesman." Her mother smiled at Vivian. "Mr. Bosco is the top salesman in his company." Vivian murmured congratulations. "And have been these past dozen years," said Mr. Bosco proudly. "Oh, I do it all old school, yes I do, and by the book. And even in these last years, when everything has slowed down so much on account of the Depression, I have never let Mr. Purdue down. He knows he can always count on me to pull him through." "Mr. Purdue must be very pleased with you. I hope he rewards you fittingly in accordance with your contributions?" her mother asked from the kitchen. "Well, there have been lean years, but I have always received an annual sales bonus of some kind. It is important, of course, but I don't work as hard as I do because of the bonus. I do it because I am proud of my work and would never dream of letting Mr. Purdue down. No, sir. He knows what he can expect from me." Vivian brought a glass of cool water over for their guest out of the icebox and set it before him. He took it with a nod and slurped it down gratefully, the tufts of hair above his ears slightly shaking. Then he set down the glass and mopped his brow again with his handkerchief. A feeling of revulsion toward him came over her again. Vivian wondered if the entire evening would be spent in conversation about his prowess as a salesman, and if so, that might require more stamina than she had in her. Fortunately, with his next sentence, Mr. Bosco changed the subject. "I have brought you two ladies something," he said, reaching down and rummaging through his small suitcase. He pulled up a piece of folded floral print fabric that looked to be a kind of muslin. "I saw it and, well, surely two such skilled seamstresses should be able to put this to good use." Her mother came out of the kitchen with a small wine glass filled with red wine and set it in front of their guest. "Oh, but this is much too lovely," she exclaimed, lifting the top layer of the folded fabric with careful fingers. "This must be quite costly material." "Pshaw," said Mr. Bosco. "I hope you do enjoy it. Well, what's this? Am I going to be left to drink all by myself? Where is your glass, Mrs. Prevett? And for the little lady?" "Oh, Vivian is a bit young for wine. She only recently turned 16, explained her mother, looking over at Vivian, who had sat down across the table from their guest. 16 is the perfect age for wine. Put some color into those pale cheeks," insisted Mr. Bosco. "Let's all make a toast." "Well, perhaps just a little wine, then," said Vivian's mother, and she went to the cabinet to take out one more wine glass from the collection of 6 glasses that she still had from her mother. She filled her own glass, and then filled the last one for Vivian, and set it in front of her. Vivian looked at it with surprise. Her mother had never allowed her to drink wine before. "To a wonderful future for all of us, but especially for Miss Vivian," said Mr. Bosco, and raised his arm. They all clinked glasses and then drank. To Vivian, the wine tasted like unexpectedly smooth and savory food, like a good olive. She enjoyed olives, but rarely had any to eat, since they were so very expensive. Similarly, this wine was redolent of luxury to her. "Vivian, please come and assist me so that I can get everything to the table," said her mother, and Vivian immediately stood up to obey. "Yes, better you than me," said Mr. Bosco. "My past experience suggests I should steer clear of transporting breakable dishware. Fortunately, in fabric sales, I have found a viable livelihood for myself, even with my clumsy fingers. My own mother always said I was the least careful boy in Meridian when it came to handling the dishes." He guffawed loudly. "Have you lived your whole life in Meridian, then?" asked her mother politely. "Oh, yes, born and raised, ma'am. I come from a long line of preachers, fine folks, yes, indeed. When Meridian was being founded, I reckon they figured they needed some good old-fashioned preaching to keep the ruffians in check. So they gave my grandfather his land for free, in exchange for him moving to town with his family. He was some character, my grandfather, and he hated Yankees near as much as he hated sin. Before the Battle of Meridian, he is said to have taken apart his picket fence with his bare hands to use as weapons against Sherman's troops, for when the rifle ammunition would run out. Only Sherman was in and out of there so fast it was all that came of it was my grandmother complaining for the next 5 years that she needed a new fence. He was not a practical man, you might say, but I'd like to think that us Boscos have all inherited a piece of his fighting spirit." Her mother brought out the poulet valet d'auge and set it proudly on the table. Mr. Bosco leaned over and sniffed appreciatively. "This is from a recipe that has long been in our family," her mother explained. "I do hope you will enjoy it." "It smells wonderful," said Mr. Bosco, licking his lips. "Let's tuck in." Vivian took another sip of wine and watched as her mother served their guest, and then herself, and then her daughter. The wine was creating a pleasant sensation in her, a kind of radiating warmth that made even Mr. Bosco seem tolerable. The sudden silence was filled with the scraping of utensils. Her mother returned to her seat. "It isn't much, perhaps, but Vivian and I live rather modestly, and of course we must also watch our figures, or else we would have to go back and let out all of our dresses." "I suppose I should watch my figure as well," laughed Mr. Bosco, putting down his knife and fork and resting his hands on his protruding belly. "Whenever I'm in New Orleans, I find myself succumbing to your pastries and other delicacies. Before I took on the New Orleans sales territory, I looked like a thinner version of Charlie Chaplin. Also, the late Mrs. Bosco was always a terrible cook. What she could do to ham and eggs even would make your hair stand on end. But this is really very, very good. What is in it?" "Well, Calvados, besides other things, but—" "I see your glass is empty. Vivian, please pour Mr. Bosco more wine," said her mother. "Ah, yes, indeed," agreed Mr. Bosco, happily relinquishing his glass. "Everything is most delicious. You know, this fine meal and the wine remind me of a trip I once took to Natchez with Mr. Perdue. Mrs. Perdue suffers from a sensitive gallbladder, so when he is home, she has the cook boil everything until you can't tell the ingredients one from each other. So when we hit Natchez, oh boy, I think we stopped at every restaurant in town at least once." He laughed, his exuberance readily filling the small room. Actually, Ink was there too. Ink Jackson, so called because he can sign more new customers up in a week than anyone else on record. He doesn't get 'em all to actually come through, but he sure can sign 'em. "Oh dear," said Vivian's mother. "With a name like Ink Jackson, he sounds like a bootlegger." "Oh no, not at all." Mr. Bosco waved his hand. "He's this little guy, stands about so tall, hair all curly, looks like some kind of yet-to-be-discovered exotic monkey, and he is the biggest trickster I've ever met. So on that trip, after one particularly filling lunch—" And this was the point in the evening at which Vivian realized that Mr. Bosco would not be asking any questions about her or her mother or anything about their lives. As long as he didn't run out of material, it would be a one-man show of anecdotes, and all that was needed was to be a polite audience. Vivian looked over at her mother, cheeks flushed with the heat of the room and with the wine, listening and laughing, and it struck her how very lonely and desperate life must be for her mother, to sit there and actually enjoy an evening with a man like Mr. Bosco. He, in turn, tapped at his wine-glass with his fingers, smiled at first one and then the other of his audience members, and continued his tale with one humorous embellishment after another. After the story of the practical jokes of Ink Jackson and Natchez had ended, Mr. Bosco poured himself and her mother more wine, dropping the last of it in Vivian's glass. The foreign tang of it interested her curious tongue, and she savored each sip, feeling that the permission to engage in such an adult pastime perhaps partly made up for having to listen to this self-absorbed character. The light in the room now came almost entirely from the candles, and they animated Mr. Bosco's moist, emoting features ever more sharply. "But what a fool I must be! I can't believe I'm wasting the evening of two such fine ladies as yourselves, with rambles on the exploits of a certified fool like Ink Jackson. But you know, not everything that happened with him was just for laughs. There were spooky things, too, sometimes. The hands-down scariest thing that ever befell me and Mr. Perdue with Ink Jackson was in Biloxi. It was our custom to work hard all day, but then to stay out late into the evenings, dining in small restaurants and talking about business, you know. Never any craziness or dancing or girls or anything like that. No, ma'am. Sometimes our business conversations took us late into the night, and then, when we walked out of the restaurant, the streets would be dark and quiet. Mr. Perdue would roll out of the restaurant and say that his stomach was full to exploding and that he was ready to call it a night, and I was usually also eager to turn in. Ink Jackson, though, was always a live wire and seemed to run on some kind of endless fuel, and he was always up for another walk in the dark before going back to the hotel. Well, on this occasion, we got out of the restaurant close to midnight. They had closed long before, but let us sit there because Ink and Mr. Perdue kept ordering drinks. Not me, you understand. I'm very strict about these sorts of things. We walked out to the nearest corner, where the street lamp was, and Ink went left, while Mr. Perdue and I went right, back to the Excalibur Hotel, a dreadful establishment with the lumpiest beds in all of Biloxi. When we reached the hotel, we spoke for a bit, and then I bade Mr. Perdue good night. I went to my room, relaxed with some light reading, and had just gotten into my sleepwear and pulled back the covers when there came a frantic knocking at my door. "Who could that be at this hour?" says I. Mr. Perdue had not stepped away from the dinner table in a state that would have induced in him a desire for anything besides a bicarbonate of soda, so it either had to be Ink, or it had to be a stranger. You travel with cash on your person in my line of work, and so you quickly learn to take care of yourself. I've never carried a firearm because Mrs. Bosco always frowned upon it, and Mr. Perdue did as well, but I have made it my habit to travel with a belt, with a large and heavy metal buckle, just in case I ever needed some protection. Now I pulled it out of the loops on my pants, gathered it together in my hand, so that it was bent double like a folded whip, with the buckle ready to pound onto the skull of any attacker. My heart was going a bit faster than usual, I can tell you, as I walked toward that door. "Who is it?" I called out. At first, I heard only a cry, and then some muffled moaning, and then a body slid against the length of my bedroom door. Whoever it was, he was no longer upright. Some drunk who got confused and had misremembered his room number, I thought. Still holding the belt loosely in my one hand, I slowly opened the latch with the other, and as I pulled the door back, Ink Jackson fell out onto the floor of my room. "How truly terrifying," said Vivian's mother in a shocked voice. "What was the matter with him? Was he all right?" Vivian dropped her fork so that it clattered against the plate. What an unusual tale to tell at a dinner party to two ladies. On the other hand, this was far more interesting than hearing Mr. Bosco speak further about himself. Mr. Bosco continued. "Well, I couldn't tell at first if he was all right. He kept trying to speak, but all I could make out was gibberish. The man was completely terrified. I reached for his hand to pull him upright, and only then did I realize that he was badly injured. I rolled him over to his side and saw that blood had seeped out in a circular stain across his suit jacket and was now staining the hotel carpet. 'Ink, what happened? Who did this to you?' I asked him. I was shocked to the core, I can tell you. Never in all my traveling days had I seen the like. I put 2 pillows under him, told him to lie still, and I ran down to the hotel lobby to have them call for a doctor. Then I ran up and woke Mr. Perdue, and we both hurried back to keep Ink company until the doctor could come. We had nothing to give him, poor man, except a glass of water and a swig from my gin flask that I always carry in my luggage, purely for medicinal purposes, of course. Anyways, that seemed to calm him, and he took a few deep breaths, became more coherent, and started telling us the most fantastical tale. It seems that he had been walking for only about 10 minutes or so, walking in to visit a kind of a late-night dance hall or such, when he came back out, and he thought he spotted a man following him in the empty streets. When Ink slowed down, the man slowed down, and when Ink began walking faster, the man also began walking faster. It had been a rather long dinner, and Ink had never been a teetotaler, so he thought that he may have imagined it, but then he turned around, for a moment saw no one there, and then suddenly the man burst out of the alley near to him, stopped still halfway in the shadows, leaned against the wall, and pulled something out of his pocket. Well, Ink was sure that it was a gun, and he said that his heart just about stopped in that moment. But it was not a gun. "What was it?" asked Vivian with suspense, the effect of the wine further amplifying the gripping effect of Mr. Bosco's tale. She leaned forward in spite of herself. It was a yo-yo, so it would appear, by the way the man pulled it out of his pocket, and then proceeded to let it drop out of his palm and toward the dark shadows by his shoes, and then pull it up again. It was, Ink told us, somehow the most macabre thing he had ever seen. "What do you want from me?" Ink asked the man. "I think you should run," the man calmly told Ink. And I have long remembered this exactly because it struck me as a really frightening thing for anyone to say. Well, Ink did not need any more encouragement. He said he ran the fastest that he has ever run. And as he was a track and field star back in his school years, that was probably a good deal faster than I have ever run. Vivian tried to imagine the rotund, aging Mr. Bosco running, but it was no use. She wondered how fast she could run under similar circumstances, and hoped she would never have to find out. "He ran as fast as he could," continued Mr. Bosco, "and at first he put some real distance between himself and the mysterious man with the yo-yo. But then the man put his game away and began running after him at a speed that Ink swears he has never seen another man run. It was hard for Ink to see clearly in the dark behind him while he was focused on running forward as quickly as he could, but he told us that he thought the man coming behind him ran so fast as to be only a blur. Then the man reached him, grabbed him under the armpits, and Ink felt a blow to the head, and then everything went dark." "Oh, my goodness! Oh, what a dreadful thing to have happen! Did the man shoot your friend?" asked Vivian's mother, clearly disturbed by this violent tale. She looked uncertainly over at Vivian, no doubt wondering if this was the kind of story that Vivian should be allowed to hear. Vivian found herself sitting at the edge of her seat. Mr. Bosco had also leaned forward. Ink never knew what happened next. By the time he came back to his senses, he was lying on his stomach on the sidewalk stones, and he felt a burning pain in his back. He reached a hand around and under his jacket, felt that his shirt was damp and hot, pulled his fingers back, and looked at them and saw blood. This almost made him lose consciousness. He was certain he had been shot. He did not know how he was able to get up and get back to the hotel, but he did, and as he walked, he felt a bit better, and so instead of stopping at the front desk, he decided, who knows why, probably because he was so drunk, to walk up to my room, only he overestimated his strength. And the walk up the first few flights of stairs exhausted him, so that he collapsed against my door. Mr. Perdue and I listened to all this, and then the doctor came. He quickly examined Ink, and said that he had never seen a wound like this in his entire medical career, and that if it was a bullet wound, it was from some kind of new firearm that had yet to be widely used. Then he gave Ink the ethers and probed the wound for the bullet, but there was no bullet lodged in Ink's back. The nearest explanation that the doctor could suggest was that it was as if someone had pushed a thin metal rod or a narrow file into the middle of Ink's back, carefully missing both the spine and the ribs. The amount of blood that I had at first seen made me think it must be a very large wound, but it was not, and the doctor said that he would stitch it up and provide some bandages, and that he thought Ink should be all right, that he had been very lucky. "Was he all right, then?" asked Vivian. She suddenly found herself feeling quite bad for Ink Jackson, who hadn't seemed like a very sympathetic figure initially. "Yes, he was. The doctor was correct. It just required an extended stay for Ink Jackson in Biloxi for the stitches to heal. Ink was certain that the mysterious man had meant to kill him, but failed. We could not think of the reason as to why anyone would want to kill Ink, especially as the assailant had not touched his wallet or his watch, which were both still in Ink's possession when he reached my room. Ink Jackson had once had an unapproved rendezvous with a minister's daughter, and so he thought that perhaps this was some kind of a warning shot across his bow from the devil himself that the minister had summoned to pursue Ink. It seems silly, I know, but the image of the man playing with the yo-yo in the dark stayed burned in Ink Jackson's mind, as it has in mine, I confess, and I would say that the whole experience changed him," concluded Mr. Bosco. "I wouldn't wonder that it did," shivered Vivian's mother with a frown. "Yes, there are strange things in this big, wide world," said Mr. Bosco, taking another slurping sip of his wine-glass, and finally seeming to notice how upset his tale had made his hostess. "I used to make fun of folks who told such tales and imagined they must have been brought about by the devil's drink, but now I'm less sure. Ah, well, but there I've gone and told a rather awful story. My apologies, Mrs. Privette, and Miss Vivian will think me a dull storyteller and a superstitious believer in ghosts. Let me reset our good humor here by telling you the story of how I once stayed in Peachtree City, Georgia, in the same hotel as the famous Griffin performing monkeys, and the monkeys got loose and ran amok in the hotel." There were many other light anecdotes that followed, some about Mr. Bosco's travels, and others about people that he knew back in his hometown of Meridian. True to his word, the mood had lifted again, and the room now seemed full of a kind of relaxed enjoyment of the evening, a lethargy of social obligation that was both pleasant and unfamiliar. Vivian was unsure if it was the wine or his big grin and enthusiasm for his storytelling material, but it suddenly seemed harder to dislike this man than when he had first walked in. With the empty wine bottle now standing on the table between them all, and a second bottle well on its way to empty also, their guest had offhandedly inquired about the leftover Calvados, and now they were drinking that. "Do tell us more about your life in Meridian, Mr. Bosco," urged her mother, and Vivian noticed that she had begun to sip at her wine only symbolically by now. Mr. Bosco took another sip, sat back, and smiled a wide smile. "Well, it is a very upstanding town, very fine people, you know, but of course I shall not claim to be an impartial judge on the matter. I have a small brick cottage not too far from Gallagher Creek, with a pleasing garden all around. Mostly my elderly neighbors tend to the garden, since I'm so often called away on business, but it's all to the good, since my garden has never looked better." He smiled, and his eyes lingered on Vivian with an appreciative smile. "And there are, of course, many opportunities for amusement in Meridian for a young lady such as yourself. How old are you again?" he asked. 16, answered Vivian. "Oh, sweet heaven, only 16. Mr. Bosco took another drink of his Calvados while rolling his eyes ceilingward. "Why, I remember when I was 16 or 17. Life was a bowl of cherries back then, that it was. We boys would scuffle in the dust behind the pharmacy building over beautiful young girls such as yourself, and then we would run off to our dates with shiners around our eyes. Finer specimens of young men you can hardly even imagine." Both Vivian and her mother laughed. For her part, Vivian could not imagine Mr. Bosco as ever having been young, ever having had a head full of hair or a boyish physique, and certainly he could never have fit the description of a fine specimen of a young man. And when he spoke of having a shiner around his eye, she could only picture it on him now, as the man he was, balding head gleaming in the candlelight, and that was decidedly silly. The young lasses of Meridian sure must have had some grand old dates with Mr. Bosco and his peers. Her mother, beautiful and regal in the dim light, wiped daintily at the corner of her mouth with her napkin, took a deep breath, and then looked over at the small clock on the wall shelf. "Oh, what an evening of merriment and fine company you have brought us, Mr. Bosco. We rarely get to enjoy such a lively evening. Why, time has run by so quickly, it is hard to believe it is already well past 11. Vivian, can you please help take these dishes into the kitchen?" At these words, Mr. Bosco, who had been smiling contentedly into the darkness, and apparently still contemplating the glories of his youthful years, as if he could see them rolling out before him, brought himself back to the present. Yes, of course. Please do forgive me. I have kept you both too long in your hostessing duties. I can only say, in my defense, that the charm of the present company swept away from me all sense of time, as I too have enjoyed a wonderful evening of rare delight. When I dine with Ink Jackson or Mr. Perdue, usually it is I who am tapping at my watch and pointing out that it is time to part ways. Well, in the case of Ink, let's be honest, sometimes have to tap that watch right up against his knobby old head to even get his attention, particularly when he is already face forward on the table and snoring loudly, ha-ha. And with a loud laugh, Mr. Bosco stood up, his chair scraping against the floor with a loud sound of protest. The facilities are which way? He asked, tugging under his protruding stomach at his large belt. Out in the hall, I fear, replied her mother. Here, let me get the door for you. She opened the door of the apartment and pointed to the right. With a mumbled thanks, their guest moved down the hall. He walked without swaying, but it was clear that the Calvados had taken its toll. Vivian also discovered, when she stood up from her chair, that the dark room, thick with the smell of candles and cooking, was going around in circles. She had never experienced such a thing before, and was eager to explore the sensation, while at the same time hoping to outwardly deny its existence to anyone else. Sounds of loud conversation and amusement drifted up from the street and seeped into the apartment. Her mother brought one of the candlesticks into the kitchen and set it by the sink. With times as tough as they had become recently, there was no need to waste any electrical light. Vivian rinsed the 2 wine glasses she had thus far brought from the table and handed them to her mother. Her mother took them back to the dinner table and began drying them by the light of the other candles. The apartment door opened and Mr. Bosco returned. Ah, efficient already with the clean-up, he said lightly. Well, perhaps I could also lend a hand. He picked up the pan in which the poulet valet d'auge had been prepared, and he carried it into the kitchen. Vivian stood alone at the sink, the water running quietly in the dark, and expected him to bring the pan over so she could put it in the sink. Instead, she heard him put it down on the small table under the one kitchen shelf. Puzzled, but too sleepy and tipsy to think clearly about this development, she frowned and turned slightly to her right. And there was Mr. Bosco, his arms sliding around her waist. "Oh, Miss Vivian," he whispered huskily, his Calvados-laced breath hot against her neck, "you have to realize how difficult it is for me to—" His hands moved over her rib cage, moving higher. Vivian screamed. She pushed against his pudgy heft with her 2 wet hands. "Let go! Don't touch me!" she shouted, tussling with him. There was a back and forth of pulling and scratching in the gloom. The water was still running. Then the sound of shattering glass exploded in the small kitchen. A dark, dripping stain spread from where the wine glass her mother had thrown had smashed full force against the kitchen wall, in that instant reducing their set of 6 glasses to a set of only 5. Mr. Bosco dropped his hands to his sides, shocked into a sudden sobriety. "Get out!" Her mother's voice came low and menacing from behind them. "Do you hear me? Get out! Right now, before I call the man next door to throw you out!" Mr. Bosco hesitated, perhaps evaluating in his mind whether an apology would be in order and might salvage the evening. It was an unwise choice. In a flash, her mother was in the kitchen and had grabbed the pan. "Are you hard of hearing? If you're not out of here by the count of 3, I will rearrange your fat face with this pan. 1, 2... She never even had to say 3. Their guest leaped towards the door with a burst of speed no one would have expected in a man of his age. Her mother dropped the pan, ran to the dining table, hauled his small suitcase out from under it, and threw it down the hall after him, shouting, "Never come back here, you disgusting man! Never, ever!" And then she slammed the door and threw her body against it and burst into tears. Vivian ran to her mother, too stunned for the moment to even cry. "Are you all right?" Did he hurt you? Asked her mother, hugging Vivian tightly and covering her with tears. Vivian shook her head. They stood holding each other and crying, and a few moments later the man next door, as well as 2 other neighbors, came over to ask if everything was all right. Everyone in the apartment knew that the police was not likely to be of much help in their neighborhood, so security was maintained more by mutual care of the residents. Her mother dried her hysterical tears and assured everyone that she and Vivian were fine. Their visitor had merely had too much to drink, but it was all right. He had gone. No sooner had everyone gone again than Vivian felt the full post-shock exhaustion come over her, and she mumbled to her mother that she was going off to ready herself for bed. She gathered her toothbrush and nightgown and headed out into the hall to the communal bathroom. In the dark of the bathroom, there was a socket for a bulb, but never any bulb. She stood and ran the water until it felt almost cold. Then she scrubbed and scrubbed at her skin, her tears falling into the cracked porcelain of the sink. It seemed like no amount of abrasion could ever wipe away the slimy traces of Mr. Bosco's pudgy fingertips, no matter how long she washed. She turned off the water, slumped against the wall, sat in the dark on the dirty floor, and cried. Then, when she thought she might actually fall asleep in the bathroom, she finished up and tiptoed back into the apartment. Her mother had already made up her pull-out mattress, and Vivian threw herself onto it. From the alcove where her mother's bed was, Vivian could hear stifled sobs in the darkness. In the dark, Vivian could see the dark outlines of the dining chairs, and she did what she didn't do often, but only when life pushed her back to the wall and she was sick with misery, something she had often done as a small girl. She imagined her father sitting there, looking the way he did in the one picture that her mother had of him, young, healthy, handsome, and full of smiles, and he was reaching toward her in the dark to soothe a warm hand over her hair, and she could almost hear him saying in a soft, deep voice, "Don't worry about it, darling. It's going to be all right. Everything is going to be all right. You aren't hurt. No one is going to hurt you. I won't let them. Sleep now. I'm right here. Nothing bad is going to happen. I'm going to sit here all night and make sure of it." And then, as if someone had suddenly pounded her head in with the frying pan, she was gone, falling into the dark space where there are no dreams. Neither Vivian nor her mother ever spoke of that evening again, but things changed afterwards. Her mother stopped speaking of potentially marrying in order to get them out of their constrained circumstances, and instead she began to speak only of Vivian finding a nice young man and Vivian getting married. It was as if she could no longer see herself as a woman still of an age to attract a suitor, as if her self-confidence had been broken. All talk of potential suitors for herself ceased. The piece of floral print muslin material that their loathsome guest had left behind was sewn into a grotesque gown of matronly proportions for Mrs. Beaufort, the only one of their clients who was hated enough to deserve such a cursed piece of fabric. As for Vivian, who had already long struggled to believe in dreams of a wonderful future, it was as if the experience had broken the last crumb of her faith. She would go off to bed after conversations with her mother about their future, pull the covers up defensively under her chin, and imagine that she had been forced to marry someone like Mr. Bosco, and how his hot, sweaty hands were moving over her bare skin, and there was nothing she could do about it, and no amount of screaming could make it stop. Nadine still often chattered on about her dreams for Prince Charming to sweep her into his arms, But Vivian could not imagine ever wanting to be swept up into anyone's arms. And when Nadine suggested an evening excursion into the city to meet up with other young people for dancing, Vivian excused herself on the grounds of a smashing headache and went home instead. In this way, a few weeks passed. Then, one particularly sunny and hot summer morning, her small and previously predictable world took another hit. Her mother asked her to go down to the ribbon and button shop near the Basin Street train station and pick up a dozen more cream-colored silk-wrapped buttons for a dress she was finishing. And Vivian was on her way down the sidewalk to the shop when something caught her attention. A mere few steps from her now, a young boy stood alone in the middle of the sidewalk, holding a small, bright red balloon. As Vivian watched, its string slipped out of the boy's grasp, and the balloon drifted upward, where a sudden puff of breeze pushed it down the street. The boy gave a cry and started to run after it, hand reaching skyward to catch at its string, but he had no chance, since in the very next moment, a man on a bicycle came zooming into view. His front bicycle wheel hit an empty milk crate left out on the sidewalk. The rider and a couple of brown paper-wrapped packages went airborne, and the bicycle made a loud crashing noise, which Vivian still heard, but no longer saw. The firm pavement inexplicably reached up and delivered a ringing slap to the side of her head, and then, like a radio signal that was suddenly cut, everything was suddenly torn away, and she fell into the inky black.